You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I used to work for the former president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari, as a senior special assistant for digital transformation. One of the key things I learned was unintended consequences in the fact that the act has to be interpreted by other people. So that's why now is really important. Now is important for the collaboration. Now is important for execution. That's why now is the time where we need to start looking at the problems and executing the solutions. That what we must look at is the digital evolutionary path. We must look at where are we in the digital evolutionary path and see which of the different digital transformations we have not done and avoid leapfrogging for Africa.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest, Oswald Osaretin Guobadia, the former Senior Special Assistant on Digital Transformation to the President of Nigeria, and spearheaded the creation and execution of the Nigeria Startup Act. Welcome.
Thank
Oswald.
you.
How are you?
Not bad. Thanks for having me, Tessa. Good to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast and looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I like to start from the beginning, so I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Oswald Osaretin Guobadia.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. As you already said, my name is Oswald. And you've also said that I used to work for the former president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari, as a senior special assistant for digital transformation. Prior to that, I ran a company in Nigeria called DBH Africa, which was an infrastructure and technology company. And prior to that, I worked in the States as a vice president in technology at Goldman Sachs. So, I mean, I wouldn't go further than that. I've had a long career in technology. I've even skipped a few just to sort of explain the career path. And I live in Nigeria and in Delaware, and I kind of go between those two places. But right now, which is more exciting, I've just recently launched a new company, which is called Digita. And the purpose of Digita, it's basically a practice to support the digital journey, the digital evolution. And we've also released a white paper, but we'll talk more about that.
Yes, fantastic. So you've given us great insights into your professional career and your new company, Digita. I was hoping you could share some of the key milestones in your 25-year journey as a technology and business transformational leader, particularly highlighting experiences that shaped the pivotal work that you did in terms of the Nigeria Startup Act.
So I tend to tell people a lot of times that all work is good experience.
Yes.
And what tends to happen is that you never know what skills you would need to utilize on your new thing you're doing. So as every gig you do, you better treat it as an educational experience and take whatever skill sets you learn from that and put it on something I call a toolkit for the day you will need it again. And interestingly enough, some of these skills are not all from professional experiences. Some of them are from, either professional organizations you're part of, or even fun organizations you're part of, that you may pick up relationships or certain skills to help you execute things in the future or in your present, I would say. I would say that, my career, I really, started from, I tell people all the time that I've gone from pulling cables to now doing policy. My very first job, which was at Credit Suisse First Boston over 25 years ago, was testing cables, part of a huge project, which was migrating, setting up a new head office for investment bank and setting up that office for their use. So that was 25 years testing cables. Then I now moved on to become a network engineer when I learned, a lot of the basics about technology from the ground up. When you look at technology as a stack, looking at apps as the top of the stack, at the bottom of the stack is connectivity and all the transmission type technologies that you need to learn. So as a network engineer, which I did for a number of years, did at Goldman and some consulting gigs that I did as well before Goldman. And then I now progressed to become a project manager and a program manager, where I managed a number of key projects across the globe for that financial institution, Goldman. And then, it gets a bit more interesting. I'm moving to Nigeria. In Nigeria, I ran infrastructure for the United Bank for Africa. And it was an interesting time when they actually were doing their merger. So that afforded me a lot of opportunity to learn who the market players were, what the issues were in the infrastructure in the country.
Yes.
Being one of the bigger buyers in the country, I got to deal with all of the vendors and even, impact how the vendors operated. Got to participate in a lot of infrastructure stabilization projects around ATMs and general connectivity and bank security. And some of these things, form the foundation for what we see today when we start thinking about, banking security that's led to fintech and infrastructure stability that's led to a number of things in the banking sector, so in the financial sector. So that's sort of been an interesting experience. And then I moved on to start a consulting firm, which was Prefinity, and that got acquired by a company called DBH Solutions. And down the road, we ended up developing a company called DBH Africa because we're now doing a number of projects in different parts of the continent. But DBH has done a number of infrastructure projects, from building data centers to running cables from major data centers to building trading floors for almost every bank that has a trading floor in Nigeria was built by DBH, even the CDN. So we've done a lot of major infrastructure projects in the workspace. And DBH, interestingly enough, was kind of a combination of all my experiences across my working career, right? So I was doing network projects, I was doing infrastructure projects, we're doing race floor projects, a number of projects that were just infrastructure related. And then I got the call to work for Mr. President, the previous Mr. President. And that brought me into the policy side, which was quite interesting, a lot of learning. But the understanding of being an entrepreneur and the understanding of having done technology sort of from a ground up approach and knowing the pains of being an entrepreneur led to the initiation of the Startup Act. One of the first things I did was I sat down with industry leaders on my appointment. And one of the key things that was basically highlighted as a potential solution was the putting out a bill that will resolve a number of issues. So if anybody look at the Startup Act, Nigerian Startup Act, you will see that it was very much written from a entrepreneurial mindset. About 99.9% of the provisions in that act were put together by the private sector to solve private sector issues. So it's pretty much a seed. They just plant seeds all over the document, and in implementation of it, we'll be able to grow into impactful solutions to enable us have that environment that will allow startups to grow and thrive in Nigeria.
Yes.
Then the last part, which is digital, interesting enough, is a combination of all of it, right? So I've done policy, I've done infrastructure. The issues we need to resolve in Africa lie in that from infrastructure space and that whole digital space to the policy side of it. And that's what digital aims to solve for the pace and precision in developing our digital revolution path.
Fantastic. I like what you said about all work is good experience, and most notably is your work as the former Senior Special Assistant on Digital Transformation. I know you mentioned that you got a call, but how did this opportunity actually come about?
Yeah, it's good. Anybody who's read my book will read a chapter called 300 Missing Pages, right? So I have a book out there which talks about entrepreneurship on the continent. And, we always say that we must tell all of the story. And so that's what your question is directly addressing. Yeah, I got a call. Amen. No, so it's actually a funny story. There was an appointment made for a new chief of staff in 2020, Professor Gambari. And when I saw the name, I'm like, wait a minute, this name is quite familiar to me as a friend of mine. But I didn't have his last name in my phone. I just had his name as Omar. And I called Omar and I said, Omar, is this your dad? And he said, yes. And I was like, oh, fantastic. I said, just make sure you get him good people, is what I said to him. This is a great opportunity to have some impact. It was in the heart of COVID. And, all I said was, I hope you support him, in meeting the goals of this role, and also ensure you help him get good people. And that's how the call ended. It was sort of a congratulatory message. And then it couldn't have been 2 days later, Omar sends me a message and said, send me your resume. And two things played there that couldn't allow me to back away. I mean, there's several reasons to back away. One, it's the heart of COVID. I'm in America with my family. Nobody really wanted to move. I'm talking, this is June, July of August of 2020.
Yes.
I remember thinking, he's asked me for my resume, and there was two things that played out there. One was I always said that if government asks me to help, I will. The reason why that was because I was very inquisitive as to what was happening within governance that affects the private sector. I wanted to go learn. I wanted that education of what exactly happens in governance and how governance impacts the private sector activities. So that was always something I was inquisitive about. So when you said bring your resume, that's what that meant to me. It's almost like it was Harvard or any of the top schools asking me to come sign up and become a fellow or to come for an education. So I sent my resume. And the second thing was, obviously, I already put my foot in my mouth by saying he better get good people. So inherently, he was telling me that I was that good person.
Yes.
And that I should bring my resume. So I obviously couldn't say no. I sent my resume, and in about a month of evaluations and interviewing other people, I was successful and I was appointed into the role.
The power of collaboration and connecting.
Yes.
You mentioned that you're inquisitive about governance. So if we look at the Act, can you elaborate on the objectives and, I guess, the impact the Act has had on Nigeria's tech ecosystem?
I will start that question by saying happy anniversary of it becoming an Act.
Oh, yes.
So, it just hit me now that when you just asked that question that, how far it's gone and how far it hasn't. So unfortunately, in this year's time, not too much of the Act has been implemented. And that's primarily due to the transition in the election period. We passed the Act, and then soon after election started, we went into transition. And a great part of that has not happened. We had hoped that the fact that, you have the government that stays and the government that leaves, that it being in the hands of the government that stays. And that's one of the strategic things that we did, because what tends to happen with people in my role is that we do something amazing, we did it, and we never quite handed it over. So when we leave, because I was very much the government that leaves, is that constitutionally motivated to leave, because May 29th, that administration ends and I'm part of the former administration, so I exit. But it's the government that stays that never leaves. And the Act was designed to work with the government that stays. So I think what is required now is that the benefactors of the Act, who the Act intends to benefit, should request and demand that the new administration takes it on and implements it expeditiously. But what you will find, if you look at the document that was released recently by the Ministry of Communications, Innovation and Digital Economy, you will find that one of the key things they intend to implement is the Nigerian Startup Act. It actually has a whole page to itself stating that this is important and this is something we must do. So we just need to hold them accountable to ensure that that happens. The Act, as I've said earlier, is a seed. It really plants a seed on a number of key issues. If you read the Act, I will give you 5 perspectives in which you should sort of look at the Act from. If you read the Act, you will see that it really intends to touch a number of things, and it intends to create a framework to ensure that a number of those things continue to be monitored, that we can assure performance in those areas. So the 5 perspectives that I will give for most people to read the Act, not most people, everybody to read the Act, is collaboration, engagement, incentives, linkages, and support. Now, when you read the Act and you think of it from these 5 perspectives, you will see that the Act intends to increase the collaboration between this ecosystem and governments and governance. So there's a council that's developed in the Act, and the idea of this council is to bring governance closer to this sector intentionally and deliberately. The council is broken up into government, federal government at the very senior levels, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, a number of key ministers, and private sector people on an 8-6 split, so that there can be deliberation that happens on that level to ensure engagement, which is another perspective, between governance and this sector. So the intention is that, somebody in this sector can easily just reach into senior government and say, hey, this is an issue that's preventing growth. How can we deal with it? And there's an engagement model within the Act that brings all the MDAs, which is the ministries, departments, and agencies, brings them once again close to what we call the consultative forum, and the consultative forum is made up of private sector folks, where there can be engagement about the issues, and then those issues can now be tabled up into the council for deliberation and hopefully for a decision to be made and mandated. So that framework was what was really designed in the Act. It's the biggest part of the Act, where it tried to drive decision-making and very close monitoring and evaluation of the activities within the ecosystem, because we understand that the ecosystem is an opportunity for us to take a position in Africa, because we have all the key ingredients. We have young people who are very intelligent and can be trained to do amazing things. We have a massive market where we can test ideas and sell ideas into. And we also have a lot of problems. We never tend to stain problems and issues as a positive, but it is. We have a lot of problems that can be solved with digital solutions. So if you put these three things together and add policy together, we have the opportunity to take a massive position globally. I had a conversation just today with somebody who was questioning me and asking me about How do we grow into the world? How do we grow globally? How do we grow into Africa? And after discussing different strategies on how to do that, I also brought to their attention that we haven't even grown within Nigeria, right? So Nigeria market, we haven't even expanded into it yet, because Nigeria market, we have, digital literacy problems, we have digital inclusion problems and access problems, which ultimately prevents us from getting the full market access, right? So if we say we have 200 million people, the market size is not 200 million. The market size is a tenth of that, right? Because until we start dealing with access issues, telephone issues, cheaper telephone issues, literacy issues, then we're not able to expand the market. So just to touch on the other three perspectives, incentives, the Act has a number of incentives to drive behavior. There's incentives for research, there's incentives for investment, there's incentives for angel investment, there's incentives to drive foreign direct investment and keeping it here. So a lot of tax incentives to drive behavior. There's linkages that speaks to tying this particular ecosystem into the MDAs, and the support, where we support the supporters. So when you think of hubs, incubators, there's incentives in there to support their activities.
So you touched upon the key considerations and points in the Act. So reflecting on the implementation of the Act, from your perspective, what were the key challenges you faced during its execution?
So I would say one of the key things I learned was unintended consequences, right? In the fact that the Act has to be interpreted by other people. And they may not particularly be really of the same mindset as the people who actually created the document. So it could be misinterpreted for different use. It could be misinterpreted for use that are not for the all and for the narrow margin of people. So those are some things you need to worry about when you're creating public policy. How is it going to be interpreted and how is it going to be executed? So the implementation of the Act probably would say is about 3%. We've managed to set up the council. We've managed to put certain memos in places prior to the last administration leaving, certain memos in place to drive the implementation of the Act. What's really left now is just turn on the engine and drive it on, because the Act is almost self-implemented. The language of the Act pretty much is very directive. It says things like the Secretariat will do X, Y, Z. So we need to now sit down with X, Y, Z and the stakeholders of X, Y, Z and understand what that truly means and how we would drive it. The Act, for instance, doesn't really sit on a lot of funds. It sits on about 10 billion, which is almost, not really impactful if you think about it. That's almost basically about $10 million. It's seed funding. But the idea behind the Act is that the Act will plug into other source of funds. So if you think about the IDAS program, the Act has intention to plug into that. If you think about the NSIA that's managing the seed fund, it was intentional in making the NSIA the manager of the seed fund, because ultimately we believe the NSIA will look at that fund and go, okay, we need to add another 100 billion to this to be truly impactful in Nigeria. So the Act, implementation of the Act just needs the engine turned on. And as I said, the new administration has made indications that they believe is important and they're going to drive it. But I also believe that the private sector folks who are the beneficiaries of it should ring that bell and shake the banters to ensure that it happens.
As you mentioned, collaborating with key stakeholders is crucial for the success of the Act, but it can also be a challenge. Could you elaborate on the strategies that you used to bring together diverse stakeholders and ensure their participation in the Act?
Great question. So when we ran the process of the bill, becoming a bill, we created something we call the Big Tent approach. Now, the Big Tent approach, I always do when I say this, because the only way to explain it is by talking about a circus, right? So the Big Tent approach is basically a circus tent, right? Although we weren't doing anything whimsical. We did have fun under the Big Tent, but the Big Tent approach has no doors. It's pretty much open to everybody. So everybody is welcome to join the Big Tent. Everybody is welcome to be a pole holding up the purpose, which is the roof of the tent. And everybody is welcome to fully participate and own the process. So we ran that, and that's how we were able to move at a very accelerated speed, because people had ownership even before it got to their desk. So you find somebody who sits in justice has been long pulled into the process to participate in the development of the actual language of the first draft. So by the time it gets to their desk, they're more acquainted, they're very acquainted with what the document says. And this was done with a number of policymakers. So we took the approach that, the ecosystem we keep talking about, if you had put me to the mic before I joined government and asked me, hey, Oswald, who's the ecosystem? I would say I am the ecosystem and everybody else like me is the ecosystem. But on joining government, one of the key learnings was the fact that the ecosystem is made up of practitioners and policymakers. So we, the Big Tent, literally had practitioners and policymakers co-creating this policy from the ground up. And that's one of the key ways we got the document to be fully representative of a lot of ideas and also to be done on sort of the expedited timeline. Now, in implementation, we'll take the same approach, right? So once the implementation committees are set up, it will ultimately have private sector folks and public sector folks, forming committees around either thematic areas or around key provisions. So in the Act, I believe maybe provision number 36 or 35, it talks about the Nigerian Stock Exchange and giving incentive to list on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, which we believe is a very critical initiative. And who would sit on that committee to implement that? It would likely be people from the Nigerian Stock Exchange, people from the SEC, somebody who runs an investment house, and maybe some other startups who have a conversation around what is required to make the Nigerian Stock Exchange attractive. Actually, it doesn't even say the Nigerian Stock Exchange, it says exchanges. That's the language used.
Okay.
But make the exchanges an attractive vehicle for seeking liquidation, liquidity, and also seeking an exit strategy, as is done with the NASDAQ in New York and then Johannesburg Stock Exchange or the London Stock Exchange in London.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing this. So ownership was or is a crucial driver. Also crucial to a program such as this is the legacy and sustainable structure that it leaves. So if we look specifically at the, say, technology legacy of the Act, what positive legacy do you believe that it could leave?
I would say that the positive legacy is the fact that it draws attention to that collaboration is critical to deriving the value that this ecosystem could put into the world. The rest of the world is moving very quickly and getting the digital strategy right. The Startup Act is just one of many policies. I don't know that overly aggressive. It's just one of many policies that needs to be put in place to ensure that we are able to get on the right path in our digital revolution development path, or the right track. The Act itself plants seeds from the education side, when you think of NUC, to exploitation, to IP regiment, to trademark, to incentives for research, plugging research into our universities, the idea of free trade zones, FTZs, the idea of incubators, enabling them to do what they do and do it better. And then one of the, I wouldn't actually call it spin-offs, but one of the key sub-projects that are birthed from this is the idea of a state adoption, which means that we'll now go to the subnational level and create the environment for this policy to thrive. So create a local state adoption of the Act, which will create a program that will allow the activities, the conversations, the dialogue, and the collaboration to happen at the state level. So a couple of months ago, Ocean State announced that they would adopt the Nigerian Startup Act. And in that same announcement, the governor did something very interesting. He also made a very strong position about the right of way. So he understood the relationship between the Startup Act and the right of way, which speaks to access. So when you start thinking about the problem, you need infrastructure, you need access. Infrastructure even covers digital literacy, because you have to look at infrastructure as the foundational things you have to have in place to ensure that we can be able to have a thriving digital economy. So that infrastructure will speak to access. Access speaks to digital literacy, speaks to digital inclusion, speaks to connectivity, speaks to cheaper devices that you use to do the access. So these things have to be in place. So when you enter a state and you put these programs in place and you start thinking about how do you get all these things going to ensure that commerce as birthed out of the digital economy happens in this state, then you start solving a lot of other problems that happen because of the lack of activities in states. You have to start looking at states need to compete on policy. We know states have infrastructure issues, but I think we can use policy to drive the building of infrastructure in those states. So if you start thinking of states competing on policy, this is what happens everywhere else in the world.
Yes.
If you look at America, for instance, and I use this example a lot, so you may have heard it before, you ask yourself, what's the difference between Silicon Valley, Miami, and San Antonio? We cannot say this because there's resource differences, as in people, human resources, because somebody can go to Harvard and move to Miami. Fantastic idea. Miami is beautiful. People can go to Stanford and move to San Antonio. So there's a mobility in resources. So the human resources is quite available everywhere. We can't say it's infrastructure because the infrastructure is available to almost the same extent in all these states. I mean, there's some people don't understand that America also has the digital inclusion problem. that was discovered during COVID. There's certain people who just can't afford access to the internet. And they actually have a program to now solve that by giving states grants to now build internet access for poor people. So we solve this problem. Digital problems can be solved, and digital problems being solved solve other problems. Now, I would say that the difference between these four locations is policy. The policies that these states put together and put out is what attracts the different startups and companies. Amazon did not move their office to New York. They moved to North Carolina. Why? Because the policies in New York was not habitable to them and they didn't want it, so they moved to a different state. Elon Musk wants to move his car company from California to Texas because the policies in Texas are... So states in Nigeria should get to a point where they start to compete. States in Africa, countries in Africa need to get to a point where they're competing on policy. Infrastructure should be almost seen as something we must do. It is a must do, but policy is what makes a difference.
I agree. So you touched on something key there, which is the human resource issue. So if we look specifically at the human capital, human resource legacy of the Act, what positive legacy do you believe that is left in terms of creating a culture and pipeline of tech practitioners or professionals in Nigeria?
Amongst other great questions, that's another one. So it's one of those things of the Americans say, "Who's on first?" Right? And it's a running joke on where do you start, right? So we have a problem. You can't quite determine where do you start. Do you go to education and start education? Do you go to jobs and start in jobs? Do you start in the middle? Do you start? It's a multi-pronged problem, and you must have a multi-pronged solution. And the Act is just one aspect. The Act is just one prong. Right, I dare not even count the prongs on this conversation, but we could sit in a room and approach it. And like I said earlier, the white paper actually takes an attempt on an approach. The white paper Beyond Transformation Towards Digital Revolution that we just released October 1 sort of speaks to a number of the prongs, right? So the Nigerian Startup Act is just one prong. What the Nigerian Startup Act wants to do is create the opportunity to make our young people become job makers, right? So it gives an opportunity for startups to start, which is the first thing. And then the next thing, which is absolutely important, is thrive. And we believe that they start and then they thrive, then ultimately they'll become job creators. Yes. And that will now increase the number of jobs in the country. And then, I think once you start, thrive, now we want you to now dominate, right? Because we believe that African businesses can dominate globally, right? So we have a few beginning to make those kind of moves. I can see, we can only believe that some of these unicorns will ultimately, start their services outside the shores of Africa. And the uniqueness of their market will make their product unique in that new market. Because that's what I mean when I say that Nigeria, one of the positives of Nigeria is that we have a massive market, a massive and diverse market, which means ultimately you can test an idea and get several feedback from the use that you may make an idea for, for delivering food. And then you will find out that idea is a fantastic idea for delivering blood in the war zone. Yes. That's what I envision for Africa because the place is so large and diverse and our problems are very unique and many. We're still dealing with some of the very early stage problems, but we now have a very unique mix of having third world problems. Let's not even call that. We just have emerging world problems, we should call it. We have emerging world problems, but we live in a time where we have very cutting edge. We're 30 years away from computers telling us what to do, right? When we have general intelligence, AGI. So we have first emerging problems and very, very cutting edge emerging technology, all coexisting at the same time, only in this market. That gives us a unique opportunity for making very, very unique solutions, right? That may end up solving different kind of problems in other climates. So it's a very unique place to be. And then you add the fact that we have young people, a bunch of them, the rest of the world is aging out. We are refreshing. We are younger and younger and younger every year, right? So those stats are out there, 60-some%, under 25 and so forth, 1.3 billion people, it gets interesting. I mean, there's more stats now saying that Nigeria is going to be third largest country in about 30 years or so. So those, you can see where we're going. But yes, we are here now. And we're supposed to put the train tracks down to ensure we get there, right? So that's why now is really important. That is why now is important for the collaboration. That's why now is important for execution. That's why now is the time where we need to start looking at the problems and executing the solutions to get us there.
Fantastic. So it's clear that people are at the forefront of the act, and those people tend to be entrepreneurs.
Yes.
So how did you balance the need for fostering innovation and encouraging that entrepreneurial spirit while also ensuring the regulatory frameworks and stability within the startup ecosystem?
So that question takes me to another thing I quite say often. So I'm going to repeat it here because I think it covers it. It's a great way to explain it. So the issues that we tend not to understand is the lack of collaboration. And I would mention lack of collaboration this way. I would say there's a lack of collaboration on all ends of it, right? So there's let's say not for instance, as a fact, there are two main parts within the ecosystem, right? And there's a digital tech ecosystem. I'm sure this exists in other ecosystems, but I can only speak to my ecosystem. Two main parts is they're practitioners and they are policymakers. And there are other contributors, there's educators and there are lawyers and a number of other folks that are in this ecosystem. Now, what's key to note is that, these two parts, they both also have a lack of collaboration within themselves. So in governance, there's a lack of collaboration between policymakers to come up with a cohesive policy structure and regimen that spurs growth, right?
Yes.
And you'll find some of the issues there is around the formation of governance, right? How is government formed, right? We have a solution that looks yellow. Is our governance structure formed to deliver policies and regulations for yellow, or is it formed based on historical, precedents and maybe appointment and positions? And whatever else you want to pick at, that disengagement there in the mindset of the structure. If you think, for instance, that if you look at, for instance, Nigeria as an example, right? So we talk about Nigeria in focus. That's what the document does. You see in Nigeria, and I'm sure in other places as well, but we'll use Nigeria in focus, that the technology activities of government, they have a vertical structure, which is right next to other verticals. So in a company, the technology function is horizontal. Is a group shared service, is GSS. It cuts across every division, right? The technology delivery. But in Nigeria, you have a ministry and agencies that are in a vertical structure and sort of reach out to touch other vertical structures. And is not quite efficient because it's just a kind of a finger touch. They're just kind of reaching to their sides and filling the other verticals. And it becomes a battleground of whose turf is it? Who owns the technology? Should I be in there? Stay away from my turf type conversations. And this is global, right? So, but we're using Nigeria in focus. It's just that, we can't afford to have these kinds of disengagement type activities because we have real issues and real problems. So we shouldn't really be playing the games that are happening in countries where they have the basics already in place. And you can almost be assured that there's a depth in resources. So if you're in a ministry and you're head of IT, I'm more than certain that your email infrastructure is going to be adequate as me in ministry of XYZ, because I'm also a good technology professional. That's not the case. So we need a consolidation and a comprehensive, cohesive approach to addressing technology policy and infrastructure development in governance. So that's already the disengagement on the policymaker side. Then when you look at the practitioner side, there's also a disengagement in the practitioner. There's not enough collaboration between the players. I would say that if you go to America, for instance, and there's a policy about to be released that both Google and Facebook, Meta, and Amazon don't like, they're not going to fight that battle separately in a singular form. They're going to go to K Street in DC. All of them will pay the lobby group, put some funds together, and they'll work on the process to getting that policy redesigned and more collaborative to meet their needs. So that's already the two sets of problems. Now, the third problem, which is the big clincher, is the fact that there's a lack of collaboration between the practitioner side and the policymaker. So what you have is that the practitioner will start a new idea, which is intended to disrupt a certain market. And disruption is good because in disruption, something new is born. We love disruption, disruptive practices, create new things. You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Yes. And that's the idea. So disruption is going to happen and we encourage disruption. In fact, the whole Nigeria Startup Act is about encouraging disruption. Now, where the problem starts, and that's one of the key things when I say about the perspective of collaboration and engagement and what that fosters, is that the policymaker does not see disruption. He has no clue of no disruption. He sees displacement. They both D words, but mean something absolutely different. Now, in that displacement, the policymaker, whose job is to protect what exists from a regulatory perspective and set standards and intention of the government through policies, sees displacement and is going to take action to fix that displacement.
Yes.
And if there's no conversation between the practitioner and the policymaker, what you will have is what you always get. Government is trying to destroy my business. And that's going to be the outcome, right? The outcome is going to be that government is going to stop something that you and I from outside may look at it and go, oh, that thing was actually a good idea. But government doesn't see the good idea because no conversation was had. Government just sees the displacement. So you can run this little framework or this little paradigm across a number of situations that you read about where government comes out, puts out a policy or a regulation to stop an activity. There was never the conversation around how that activity was going to add value in 2 years. And maybe the fact that that activity is going to add value in 2 years means that we should take the pain of allowing that displacement to continue for 2 years and maybe find ways to manage the pain. So that conversation is what the Nigerian Startup Act intends to foster through that collaborative and engagement model that's in the first 3 or 5 pages of the Act.
Great insights, great insights. Although you've worked in government, it could be said that you are an entrepreneur. You've worked in the private sector. You've launched your own startups and businesses. What are the key lessons learned coming from the private sector and working in government?
So, when you come from private sector, one of the key things people always say is that when you come from the private sector and you come into government, it's quite difficult. I actually found it to be the opposite. I found that you sort of have to keep your pace. You don't go into government and change how you approach work. You go to government and try to impact government to yield the right outcomes. I would say that my experience with government, I got to work with very, very, very brilliant people in the civil service. There are certain rules that guide how civil servants work. And I think understanding those rules and understanding the motivation of a civil servant and the lack of, maybe not lack of, but of certain kinds of leadership to yield the right desirable results is also some of the things we need to look at. But I think a lot of people go into civil service thinking or go into public sector thinking that, oh, nobody knows what they're doing. It's just rubbish, corrupt rubbish and all that. And I think people don't tend to forget that in the end of the day, there's really no difference between private sector people and public sector people. I would say public sector people are probably sacrificing more, but I would say that that there's really no difference because we're all just citizens, right? There's no imaginary line that you cross to go over. That somebody working in the civil service also has kids and families, and there's a nephew and there's a niece and there's uncles and aunts. So we need to take a different approach on how we engage each other. And I think that's the starting point in developing the right policies, right? So what you will find in certain countries is a certain apathy between the private sector towards the government, public sector policymaker folks. And in my opinion, that's just an absolute waste of time and is one of the bigger problems in driving, collaborative engines to drive our progress. I wouldn't say recently anymore, but maybe a few months ago, I was on a panel in front of a bunch of young people who were all startup entrepreneurs or wannabe startup entrepreneurs. And what I said to them is that a lot of the policies that will likely disrupt, or should I say, stop your work based on your disruption and is a displacement to government, are developed by other young people like you. Because it's not the head of the agency that sits there and types out the policy and does the research for the policy. It's usually some other young person who probably was in university with you or in secondary school with you. And I wonder why young people are not engaging other young people in the public sector and saying, hey, what are you guys working on? Hey, this is what I'm working on. So that collaborative conversation is supposed to be happening at very, very junior levels before they get to more senior levels and the policy is cooked. I think that's not happening. That's part of the problem as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned something quite key, which is the apathy from private sector to public sector. I guess that apathy can be driven from the challenges that they face from policy. So in your opinion, what are the key challenges that emerging startups in Nigeria face, and what would you say can be done at a policy level to support their growth and sustainability?
So there are a number of issues. I mean, Nigeria is VUCA plus plus plus, Mani plus 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 plus. But I think that's what makes us special, right? Because we managed to still create, value in this environment. It's a difficult environment to do business. There are a number of issues. I mean, if you look at FX fluctuations alone, that affects anybody. I mean, if you think about it, if you had a contract that you closed a year ago and you want to go to get payment now, you'll be being devalued by almost a tenth. Right. So there's a number of issues, but I think a lot of these issues can be addressed with more of a collaborative mindset, in a sense that if we partner with government and government partners with the private sector to address problems and not look at it from a singular perspective, but more of a collaborative perspective, then we're more able to start solving these issues. There's certain sacrifices that need to happen. And, if we don't look at these sacrifices from an individualistic perspective and look at it from a collaborative, it's all of us, and these are the things we need to sacrifice to actually develop a real economy, then it's different. I think what tends to happen is that there's a general feeling that it's just I who's going through this. So you're going to have a natural kick against it. But the truth of the matter is, the change in PMS is everybody's problem. I have a car. I'm also in a boat. I'm affected by the price increases. Everybody gets to go through it. But I don't say that lightly to say that people are not, operating at different levels of the economy. And of course, you don't have enough cushion to take the impact. And that's where the social structures start to go into place. That the supposed social structure systems is supposed to help people. Then you now go, why can't we help people? Because, if you have social structures in place and help those that need the help, then you start looking at solutions that are not in place, right? So we have something called the NIN, the NIN, which over the last couple of years has been more focused on enumeration as opposed to services it can provide. Do we know who the poor are in our environment and how can we actually get aid to them? Or do we say something as intelligent as, okay, if you're going to buy petrol, use your NIN at the petrol station. And once you put your NIN in, if you are one of the people we believe don't have enough resources, I should say, resourcely challenged, I should say, then that means you get a discount at the pump. These are the solutions that are easily done, that can easily have impact tomorrow on lives. And that solution, you'll find that after we've made it so much better here in Nigeria, we can now implement it across the continent of Africa. And then you find that it's also a solution that can be used across the globe. These solutions are being packaged and sold by other countries. I mean, I was at a conference in Zimbabwe a few months ago, and there was a guy there who, he's a Kenyan, but he's speaking for the country of Estonia. So Estonia is now trying to export his small country, Estonia, who has done a lot of amazing digital transformation projects. They're on a very advanced position in the digital evolution path towards development. They're now trying to sell those solutions to the rest of the world. So it's only right that Nigeria gets its act together, that we now start exporting digital solutions and we now start importing work into Nigeria for Nigerian youth to execute locally and earn FX locally. Because when you look at the issue, going back to the FX fluctuation, the economics of it is that we don't have enough production to support our currency. And it just goes around a big circle. And you now start saying, where do you start? Well, you start by starting. And that's what the Nigerian Startup Act intended to do, give us a position to start. And a number of other policies need to go in place, which I believe the new administration will focus on, around innovation, around digital literacy, around digital inclusion. These are all key things that need to be done to drive this economy.
Fantastic. You've shared some great challenges, some innovative solutions and policies that drive new trends. So if we look past the current trends and into the future of, say, Nigeria, in the next 5 years, what lasting or continuous impact do you believe the Act will have on Nigeria's tech ecosystem and digital economy?
I would say on implementation, the Act is going to drive a number of areas. If you just think about it, and once again, I got to go back to that collaboration and engagement model. And I'll run an example through it so you can see, so you can get a sense of, because I think the Act is almost self-healing, right? It's almost self-driving. So there's one issue going around Africa right now, which is entrepreneurial visas, entrepreneurial immigration. Founders in Kenya are wondering how can they come to Nigeria and just sit here for 6 months because they want to do a market study, or they want to hire somebody from South Africa. A Nigerian founder wants to hire a developer from Kenya or South Africa or Ethiopia or Tunisia or Algeria. What is that process, and how do we eliminate the paperwork and the time and the issues and the laws around immigration for entrepreneurs in the digital space? So If Nigeria wanted to do one, let's say the consultative forum, which is the private sector folks, put together a package and say, look, this is going to be the potential impact of opening the doors to fellow Africans to come here to develop ideas and sit here, and we'll support them, it shows the impact to the economy. All they need to do is they ultimately just speak to the Secretariat. Through the Secretariat, they can engage the Immigration Department. It could quite possible that the Immigration Department will see that it makes a lot of sense and put together a policy that drives entrepreneurial visas, and then seek approval from the minister, who then seeks approval from Mr. President. And ultimately, this policy goes in place. Now, in a situation where the immigration agency doesn't see the need for this, there's a recourse for the private sector folks. They can ultimately table this to the council and present it to the council. And if you remember, I stated the council has Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, a number of key ministers and agencies sitting on the council. You could think of it as a mini Federal Executive Council. And that can be presented to them as we need entrepreneurial visas. And once presented and it makes sense, the likelihood of Mr. President approving and then releasing a mandate to the Secretariat, which will be sent to the Immigration Department, is quite high. And that just shows you that right there, in fact, if the Immigration Department had agreed to it, it's probably a longer path than presenting it to the council. So basically what that's done is create an opportunity for key critical ideas that can help the ecosystem grow, get a quicker approval and support from government, because government believes that this ecosystem is important to the growth of Nigeria.
I agree.
Yeah, so painting that just shows you just take that and plant that seed in a number of different areas, right? So if you take every provision and see what that provision intends to do, if I say to you, I'm going to give you tax incentives to research, you're a startup and you're focused on fintech. But if you open a department, you just raised $20 million and you put $500,000 in a department which you call research, and you now start researching how fintech can help health tech be better and document management system into the patient management system or whatever. I'm just making this up right now. Right there, you're going to get tax incentive, right, on your raise, because you are now doing research. So now we've planted the seed of creating research. And just imagine if you now take that and plug it into the NUC. Now your research is not sitting in your small office, but you're implanting that research into Nsukka. And you now have a multi-departmental research thing that you're funded by $500,000. We're going to incentivize that with taxes. So that's what the entire document is doing. Then if you imagine startups have been sold, so you sold this startup. Imagine that startup had gone through the Nigerian Stock Exchange first, or just so about exchanges first, and then more Nigerians had invested their money, their 10,000 naira, their 500,000 naira, 1 million naira, and is now sold. The impact of that sale would spread beyond the angel and Series A investors to more Nigerians who invest in the stock exchange and believe in the idea and have gone through a more of a democratized spread of the opportunity to have invested in that company before it was sold. So that's what the act intends to do. I myself, I'll tell you that on my version of the act, which sits on my device, I've already started editing and looking at things that I believe could be better, right? NSA 2.0, because, we could always improve on this. So the next act will escalate the intentions of the first act, but we must implement it first, right? So there's several areas. It's a seed and it touches so many areas. If you look at the fact there's a monitoring and evaluation dashboard, which sits on a dashboard that will be sitting in front of the council, which means Mr. President. So we can easily say that, I put in a patent request in January and it's now June and I don't have it. So the startups that make requests through the portal, because it's a portal which is part of the engagement model, we can now track their issues. We can track that they went to CAC in December and it's now February and they don't have an answer. And then when you take the Ease of Doing Business Act that was passed towards the end of the previous administration, you will find that some of the provisions there actually support the Nigerian Startup Act and just makes it really, 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 I wanted to say violent, but really, really, really efficient and very, very on the point, in the sense that there's a provision that says that if we apply for something and it goes beyond a number of days, it's approved. But in a paper form, you can't really determine or can't track that properly. But once you start going through a portal that tracks it, then those rules will be able to apply to ensure that this ecosystem gets what it needs from an approval perspective.
Fantastic. If we go from the future of Nigeria in the next 5 years, if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? What work will you be doing to contribute to Nigeria or Africa's tech ecosystem?
I mean, like I've said, I've started a company called Digital, and this practice of Digital, the main practice is to support this digital journey. In the white paper, Beyond Transformation Towards Digital Revolution, one of the key points we're making is that digital transformation is a trendish activity. That what we must look at is the digital evolutionary path for Africa. We must look at where are we in the digital evolutionary path and see which of the different digital transformations we have not done, and avoid leapfrogging. Because what tends to happen is that, let's say okay, I'll give you an example. I mean, this if you look at music, right? Music has you have the LP album, you have the 8-track, you have a cassette, you have a CD, and then you have streaming, right? Each of these things are all digital transformation. When we were on the LP and they brought the 8-track, wow, that was a digital transformation moment. In fact, when the LP album became a laser, wow, digital transformation, that was amazing. I remember my uncle had a laser player, and it was vertical instead of being horizontal. When we went to cassettes from 8-track, smaller, that was digital transformation, because the definition of digital transformation is using technology to change, enable, make easier how we work and play and live. So the cassette is smaller, you can put it in your pocket. That was digital transformation. When we went to CDs, wow, the Walkman became the CD man, and so it got a little bigger, but we appreciated it because now you had more songs, it was better quality, and we enjoyed it. The CD was great. Now, when I play, I'm actually an album collector. When I play my albums and then I go to streaming, I can tell the difference. I put on a cassette the other day, I'm like, oh God, how did we listen to this? Because I still have my cassette and I have a cassette player. And same thing with CDs. Streaming is so much better, so much quality of music. You can hold unlimited music, because now it's not in the case of, even if you think about going from the first iPod to now, iPod were limited to number of music you can carry, to now you just have all the music you want. Alexa, I don't want Alexa to do anything. Alexa, play XYZ, and it goes ahead and plays it, right? Alexa, start.
I love that. Technology in full effect.
Exactly.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, African proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are hard or when times are good.
Yep.
Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Mine is sort of the same, good or bad. I always say that prepared people always seem lucky. That the process of remaining prepared is what presents you as ready for the opportunity. And when the opportunity comes, to the outside world, it's always going to seem like, oh, such a lucky guy, oh, such a lucky girl. But it's that constant act of being prepared that sets you up for that.
Fantastic, Oswald. What a great note to finish today's conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights in terms of innovation, collaboration, digital empowerment, and in terms of the work that you've done with the Nigerian Startup Act, which serves as a shining example for aspiring entrepreneurs and policymakers alike. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Mine too. It's been great.
Fantastic. I've enjoyed our conversation. We will speak soon.
Same here. Talk to you soon. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.